We had decades of cheap, abundant gas from the mid-80s right through to the beginning of this decade, and all of that time manufacturing jobs in Australia declined. It's just completely absurd. A government claiming that they're trying to help the manufacturing industry, and instead of giving the manufacturing industry money, giving money to the gas industry.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasury. Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're talking about why a gas-led recovery will really only help the gas industry and why you should be sceptical every time you hear a minister or a commentator talk about how gas will help manufacturing. Because the fact is, most gas used in Australia is used by the gas industry itself. And really, by championing a gas-led recovery, we're only going to help the gas industry.
The Prime Minister is pledging a gas-led economic recovery.
The panel has advised the government to underwrite new gas pipelines and associated infrastructure to deliver cheap gas supply.
I'm interested in stuff that works. I'm interested in stuff that gets done.
No one's opposed to new gas. If the investment is made there.
I don't have to go on with all this BS about a gas-led recovery, which is honestly just political piffle.
Released a report overnight warning that Australians should start planning for a future without natural gas. It's an uncomfortable truth, probably, for the federal government, which has been promoting a gas-led recovery out of the coronavirus recession.
Who is the gas production likely to benefit? Is it simply just the gas exporters?
Do you think it's fair to take people's livelihoods just because you want to stick a couple of gas wells on their property?
To fully embrace with a renewable energy boom that is coming faster than a rocket.
The cost of renewables is so low that it's undercutting the economics of other forms of generation.
Gas is a fossil fuel. It is contributing both to the climate crisis and it's not necessarily going to help with our economic recovery either.
So to talk about the Australia Institute's newest report on gas and manufacturing, I'm joined by Mark Ogue, Principal Advisor at the Australia Institute. G'day, Mark.
Hi, Ebony. Good to be here.
So, Mark, in explaining the government's gas-fired recovery and its approach, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has argued that, first of all, there's a shortage of gas, particularly for the manufacturing industry, and one of his main arguments has been that providing more gas and providing more supply will help the manufacturing industry. Is that the case?
There's absolutely no shortage of gas in Australia. Australia is one of the largest gas-producing nations in the world. We're the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas, so we produce an enormous amount of gas. In fact, we export 12 times as much gas as we actually use in the manufacturing sector, and the export terminals that are used by the LNG industry just to prepare the gas for export, actually, they alone use more gas than the entire manufacturing industry in Australia. And another way...
So hang on, let me get that straight. So you're saying that the LNG export industry itself uses way more gas than the whole manufacturing industry in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So we allow a small group of huge global oil and gas majors to export gas from Australia, and the amount of gas that they use in their export terminals just to liquefy the gas, preparing it for export, is actually more than all the gas used for manufacturing in Australia.
That's quite astonishing that, we're allowing the LNG industry in Australia to export so much gas in the first place when, we've been hearing for years that we've got a supply shortage. So obviously there is no supply shortage, it's just all being exported. But can you give me a breakdown of actually how much gas Australia produces and what it's used for?
Yeah, so we, as I was saying, we produce a huge amount. There's a lot of offshore gas, so gas from oil and gas rigs out in the ocean in Western Australia, in the Northern Territory and Bass Strait in Victoria, and that's conventional gas. And then you have a whole lot of onshore gas or unconventional gas, which is mostly coal seam gas in Queensland and some from the kind of South Australia-Queensland border in the Cooper Basin, and it's a vast amount. It's around 5,000 petajoules of gas, and 78% of that is either exported or used by those LNG plants to process the gas. The next biggest user is electricity generation, which is about 10% of the gas is used for. Western Australia uses about half of that, so there's very little gas really used for electricity generation on the east coast. Then manufacturing uses about 6% of the gas produced in Australia, and the residential sector, so in our homes for heating and cooking and heating hot water, uses about 3%.
So LNG exports and the actual LNG industry uses 78% of gas, and manufacturing uses less than 8% in total. That's the comparison that we're looking at.
Yeah, around 6%.
Wow.
So this is the plan. If the energy companies choose to step up and make these investments to create that capacity, great. We will step back. If not, my government will step up and we will fill the gap. And to this end, Snowy Hydro is already developing options to build a gas generator in the Hunter Valley should the market not deliver.
So getting back to the government's argument or its proposal for a gas-fired recovery, part of that is the government's job maker plan. So part of the argument around the gas-led recovery is obviously because it will create jobs. But can you explain, I guess, where the government's coming from here and why actually the evidence suggests that it's not going to be a huge job maker, to borrow the government's term, to invest in gas? Yeah,
so the gas-fired recovery is part of the government's jobs maker plan, and it's around $50 million to open up some big new gas basins, and also give some money to a gas industry research organisation called Jazera, and potentially they're talking potentially about underwriting some new gas pipelines. It's a really strange way to try and create jobs, because if you're talking about jobs created by the gas industry itself, the gas industry is one of the least job-intensive industries in Australia. So it employs less people per dollar invested than pretty much any industry in Australia. So if the aim is to create jobs, you would be better supporting pretty much any other industry in Australia.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that in the past, and obviously during a recession, creating as many jobs as possible, using taxpayers' money, we need as much bang for buck in terms of job creation as we can get. So listeners might go back to some of the previous podcasts we've done on why gas-led recovery is a terrible idea. But coming back to this idea that increasing supply will reduce the gas price, and that's what's going to help manufacturing. So we've already established manufacturing uses about 12 times less gas than the actual gas export industry itself. Will increasing supply reduce the gas price and employ more people?
Well, the first thing to look at is what's happened in the past, because over the last decade, gas production in Australia has tripled, and at the same time, the gas price has tripled. So the evidence is that increasing production in Australia doesn't reduce the gas price, and that's largely because the gas because we export the gas, it links us to global prices. So the gas price goes up to equivalent to global prices. But when global prices have fallen, the gas price in Australia has actually stayed high. And in fact, the ACCC, the competition body, reported recently that a whole bunch of LNG shipments were sold to overseas customers at a lower cost than they were offered to gas manufacturers in Australia, which means that those LNG companies would rather take a loss than reduce the price that they're selling to manufacturers in Australia in the domestic market.
So to summarise, essentially we used to have a small domestic market, and because we've got a shitload of gas, prices were always pretty low, and then we joined ourselves up to the global market where gas prices were higher, and all of a sudden gas prices tripled along with how much gas we were exporting or supplying, and now global prices have fallen, but domestic gas prices remain pretty high. Is that a good summary?
That's right. And it's even worse than that because it's permanently raised gas prices in Australia, and that's because when gas companies mine gas, they'll always prioritise the lower cost fields, the ones that are closer and easier to access. And because they're shipping huge amounts overseas every year, twice as much as is actually used in the domestic market, all of that cheap, affordable gas has actually been sent overseas. So the only gas remaining in Australia is much more remote and expensive. And the delivered cost of getting that gas to manufacturers in Australia is likely to be, probably around $10 a gigajoule or even more. So we're never going back to days of cheap gas, and all of these new strategic gas basins that the government talks about opening up are actually very expensive gas. And that's because we've allowed all the cheap stuff. Our governments have allowed all of that cheap gas to be exported overseas.
Just to remind us why the remaining gas is more expensive to get out of the ground.
Well, if you're a gas company, you've got all your reserves and you will extract the cheaper gas first. So gas that's closer to the surface, or that you need fewer wells to extract the gas. Generally, conventional gas is cheaper to extract. And as that depletes, you'll go looking for the harder to get stuff. And coal seam gases or shale gas are examples of those, where gas is in little pockets dispersed under farmland across Australia or other countries, and you have to sink a whole lot of wells and be quite aggressive in the way you're getting it out using processes like fracking, which are not only dangerous and risky, but are also pretty expensive.
Okay.
So we're trying to squeeze the last remaining bits of gas out of difficult to access reserves.
But as Ben O'Quist, our Executive Director, is fond of saying, the government can really do anything if it puts its mind to it. So say the government does manage to bring the gas price down by just massively subsidising the gas industry, which is obviously a thing that the government wants to do. If it can do that, would that create manufacturing jobs?
Well, again, I think we've got to look at the past to see what happens if we get the gas price down. So I think it would take massive taxpayer subsidies to actually do that, but in theory you could actually do it. But you've got to remember, Australia has had cheap gas in the past. We had decades of cheap, abundant gas from the mid-80s right through to the beginning of this decade, and all of that time manufacturing jobs in Australia declined. And then when we got to the beginning of this decade in Western Australia and the middle of the decade in Eastern Australia, and we tripled gas production, manufacturing jobs in Australia continued to decline, and that includes in Western Australia, where they have a domestic gas reservation policy that's kept prices down. So there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that even if you did manage to get cheap and abundant gas, which is highly unlikely at the moment, that it would actually create manufacturing jobs. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that most manufacturing actually doesn't use gas. There's a handful of companies that are very gas intensive, and they use the vast bulk of the gas that's used in manufacturing, but they don't employ very many people.
And it's worth just reminding listeners that earlier in the year, the Australian Institute spoke to Paul Bastian, the then National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, And he had ended up really quitting that hand-picked National COVID-19 Coordination Commission because he said that the discussion ended up being completely dominated by gas and this idea of a gas-led recovery. And as Richard Dennis, our chief economist, has pointed out, we could probably actually do much more for the manufacturing industry if we just took all the money we were planning to give the gas industry and gave it directly to the manufacturing industry, or, you know, did some actual manufacturing policy instead of just subsidising the gas industry. Mark, why do you think the government is going about this in this arse-backwards way, where they're trying to help the manufacturing industry by subsidising the gas industry? Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, look, I think it's you're exactly on the point. This is a classic case of follow the money, isn't it? Because when you stand back, it's just completely absurd. A government claiming that they're trying to help the manufacturing industry, and instead of giving the manufacturing industry money, giving money to the gas industry. So the interest of the manufacturing industry isn't necessarily the same as the interest of the big LNG exporters. But the government, it's really popular to try and assist the Australian manufacturing industry because everybody wants the Australian manufacturing industry to go well, but it's not popular to give huge amounts of money to the big global oil and gas companies that export gas from Australia as LNG. But they're the ones that the government's giving the money to, and they're the ones who will benefit. And if you look at the main plank of the government's gas-fired recovery plan at the moment, it's to open up 5 new gas basins, including the massive gas basin of the Beetaloo, in the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory. So the manufacturing industry doesn't need all of that gas. The people who will benefit from that, you know, they might need a little bit of extra gas at times, or benefit from a little bit of extra gas at times, but the vast bulk of that gas will be exported as LNG. So really, this is just another big subsidy to the global LNG exporters.
Well, that's a cheerful thought.
The difference with gas too is that it's a very important feedstock for a lot of industries. You think of chemical industry, fertilisers and the like. They can't really exist without gas.
One of the other points that I just wanted to raise was this idea of that gas is needed as a feedstock, and the government often talks about the need for gas as a feedstock, that it can't be easily replaced. How big is that requirement for gas?
Yeah, well, this argument is just a complete furphy, because of all the gas produced in Australia, 1% is used by the manufacturing industry as feedstock in Australia. So, you know, there's absolutely plenty of gas for feedstock. It's not an issue. So that argument is a bit of a misdirection, really.
Okay. And lastly, I want to bring us back to climate change.
Australia's temperatures continue to rise with more frequent and intense heat waves.
But the bigger and more important reason is that gas is a fossil fuel. It's not a transition fuel, it's a fossil fuel. It causes global warming exactly the same way that burning coal does. But Mark, just summarise for us, why is going down the pathway of a gas-led recovery bad in climate terms, not just in economic terms?
We all know that climate change is really urgent. The last CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, State of the Climate report showed that the climate's changing really rapidly, and that's resulting in huge impacts, more fires, more drought, more floods, all sorts of negative outcomes for Australia. And so we know we have to reduce emissions really quickly. Gas is a fossil fuel, and sometimes its supporters argue that, well, yes, it's a fossil fuel, but it's better than coal. And in the case of electricity generation, it is a little bit better than coal under most circumstances, depending on how much leaks into the atmosphere, but it's still a huge source of emissions. And it's absolutely not necessary to burn that, because if we want to stop burning coal, we can go straight to renewables, which are already cheaper and really more reliable than gas. So if we subsidise the gas industry and keep it going, what we're doing is we're locking in a huge amount of emissions for decades to come, because the infrastructure that we're subsidising will keep going for decades to come, and we'll miss our opportunity to actually act on climate and avoid catastrophic runaway climate change.
And we'll be increasing electricity prices at the same time because renewables are cheaper as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we might wrap it up there, Mark. Thank you very much.
No worries. Great to be here, Ebony.
We're recording this on Tuesday, the 17th of November 2020, and things may have changed since recording. For example, the New South Wales government handed down its budget today, but I wasn't in the lockup, so I'm not sure if there's any news on the gas front in there. But definitely we know the New South Wales government just made a massive announcement and investment in renewable energy. So the states are really leading the way compared to the federal government here. This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned and leave us a review if you've enjoyed today's episode, as it helps other people to find the podcast. Don't forget to tune in to our next webinar. That's on Wednesday, the 18th of November, with Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, bushfire survivor Fiona Lee, and former Deputy Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales, Ken Thompson, and they'll be talking about why Australia needs a climate disaster levy. You can register at tai.org.au/webinars. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent Coronacast podcast, which comes out daily. And you can find all our latest research and the Gas and Manufacturing Report at tai.org.au. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Mark Ogue is at Mark Ogue, that's OGGE, and the Oz Institute is, of course, the Australia Institute's Twitter handle with an AUS. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. Keep washing those hands, wear a mask, stay 1.5 metres away, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks for listening.